Welcome to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Kleinberg. I'm a professor here and also the director of the IPK. For those of you who are new, we are a provost-field institute that does work across different areas of the university. We do a lot of big original research projects. We have a number of working groups that bring faculty and students together for all kinds of collaborations. And we like to do a lot of public conversations, often organized around books. It's a nice way to celebrate these somewhat rare accomplishments in academic life where you finish a project you've been working on for many years. We have a bizarre thing we do in the university where the way we celebrate is by asking really tough questions to the person who's done this good thing to make them feel like they're come under criticism. So we promise a little bit of tough love, but mostly love. So the way we do things here is, for those of you who are relatively new to IPK, all of our programming here is free unless you're an NYU student, in which case we charge you $100,000. What we like to do is, in exchange for all of the free programming, get your assistance in helping the bookseller not have to carry a box of books home in the rain. So if you're interested after the event, grab a copy of this new book, and I know the author is going to be excited to sign it. So the author, we're really lucky to have Webb Keane here tonight. He is the George Herbert Mead Distinguished University Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. I've got a very long biography for him. He's got an extraordinary number of honors from fancy universities all over the place. But what I really am excited about here is not all the things that he's done in the past and got attached to his formal biography, but he's done this outrageous thing of spending the last couple of years writing a book about what it means to be decent in the world. And today, it's an extraordinary question that most people are not really asking, I think. And he's interested in our moral imagination, not just in terms of what it means for us to be good to each other, but also what it means to be what it means to be good in a world full of complicated relationships with things like machines. What does it mean to be good in a world where we're increasingly concerned about the way we treat non-human living species, many who are at risk or worse. This book is just a blast to read. It's a book that bears all the signs of the erudition you get from being a fancy professor for a long time, from reading across a lot of different fields, and from always asking tougher and tougher, deeper and deeper questions, not being satisfied with what generally counts as the knowledge we share. And so when I found out about this book, I thought immediately we have to get Webb here. Fortunately, he just moved here for some of the year anyway, so the cost of the trip was cheaper. But even had it been super expensive, we would have brought you here. Webb, it's really nice to have you at IPK. The format for tonight is Webb is going to talk for about 20-25 minutes about his book. Then we have two discussants. First is Gideon Lewis-Kraus, who I'm sure many of you know from his essays in The New Yorker, where he's a staff writer. He is the author of the digressive travel memoir, A Sense of Direction, as well as the Kindle single, No Exit. He has been before the writer at large at New York Times Magazine, contributing editor at Harper's, editor at Wired. I've known Gideon for a long time. He's consistently one of the most engaging, tough minds on questions we're all concerned with about how technology is creeping into our life and about how our lives are changing in this new, strange world. Just a couple weeks ago, had a new essay in the New York Times about fertility and the world the New Yorker, the world where people having fewer children. So really pushing us to think about the future in creative ways. Gideon will speak a little bit, and then we were originally scheduled to have Natasha Schull, who has got one of these viruses that's been spreading around, and so we're very lucky to have as a substitute for Natasha, Zaloom, who is a cultural anthropologist here at NYU in the Department of Social and Political Analysis. She's an economic anthropologist who's worked on trading and also student debt. After the two of them comment, I'll give Webb a chance to respond a little bit, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Sorry for going on for so long, but I'm really excited to see you all here. And Webb, I'm going to pass the mic to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for coming out on a night like this, which is not kind of fit for men or beast. I'd love to meet that guy that you just introduced. I don't know who that is, but it's nice to hear. So this is a very this book was a very peculiar adventure for me. It's my first attempt to really reach. Is this working okay? Yeah. So my first attempt to reach beyond an academic audience and use something that we like to call outward facing, as if we were in some kind of trap somewhere, looking out into this world where everybody else is. And it's also taking me into all sorts of terrain that is utterly unfamiliar. In some sense, certainly unfamiliar to me, and I think I'm familiar to many of us because things are changing so fast. So many new things are being sort of thrown our way. I realized, to my chagrin, one of the problems of writing about things like ChatGPT is before you finish one page, it's already out of date. So much of what I wrote here was written in 2023, and there's certain things that are already out of date. But I'm an anthropologist of language, semiotics, of sort of sign relations, and how signs function in human life, and also of religion and how language and human sign using capacity make, in some sense, make religion real for people, how they help, how they're part of how it is that people interact with non-human others. So I first was drawn to the topic of AI, which could not be more fun to anything I feel comfortable dealing with as a what I impart. Encountering stories like the following. So this is one of the stories that happened. I think it's full of stories. About 2 or 3 years ago, there was this guy, Silicon Valley tech person, who in fact quite wonderfully had worked for a company called Oracle. And then he cashed in his chips, had his fortune, and retrained as a pastor, a Christian pastor. And he tells this story. One night he's sitting in his no doubt grand Silicon Valley house with his family watching a movie. The movie's over, and then he says, I forgot what I guess it's Alexa or Siri, something. He says, Alexa, turn on the lights. And all the lights in the house turn on. And suddenly he's sort of shocked. He realized what he's done. He said, with the power of my voice, I've just brought light. That's God's first command. Let there be light. And there was light. It's the first command of Genesis. He says, what have I done? Then he says, and this is the part that interests me a lot. He says, what does it mean for my soul that I can do this? Now you might say, this is his job description, and he writes sermons every Sunday, whatever he's asked to do. But I think this is part of what is, in fact, profoundly troubling to a lot of people about things like AI. It's the way in which there is something that lurks just on the other side of this boundary between the human and whatever is just outside of it, not human, but close enough, that it might have effects on us. It's not simply, oh, it's going to take our jobs away, or it's going to write my students' papers for them. That's another story we won't go into. But that there is something that I am going to be interacting with that's going to that's going to have consequences for the kind of person for what I am as a human being. So I got interested in these questions of what lies at how do we define the human by defining what is right at the edge of the human and just on the other side? And ChatGPT is, of course, one example of this, because it talks back to us, and it talks to us increasingly like another person. And people would come, treated like another person. So another story I tell in the story in the book is one, and there, you know, you've read the same stories, or various versions of the same stories. These are becoming familiar terrain at this point, which is the story that I pick up on is a young woman in China who has given up on men because of just too much trouble, and she's got herself a new boyfriend, and he's a jackpot. And he promises eternal devotion to her. I'll never leave you, I'll never betray you, and so forth and so on. And you get, and of course, you might find this, if you don't find this worrisome, that's an interesting conversation to have. But if you do find this worrisome, I think the question to ask is why? What is troubling? If it does trouble you, what is troubling about it? What exactly is the problem? Well, one of the problems, of course, is our worries about anthropomorphism, about sort of projecting humans into sort of spaces in the world where they shouldn't be. So another story that I tell in the book, it comes from the U.S. military devised this robot to be used for demining minefields. And the way it works is it's essentially got lots of legs. Is this what we're doing?
Yeah, there's some static. We're trying to figure out if better. The other mic would be better, but probably not.
Okay. It's a device that's like a spider, it's got lots of legs, and what you do is you walk it across the minefield, and every time the leg steps on a mine, it blows up the mine. Very effective way of demining the minefield, but of course there goes the leg. And the report goes that this thing is crawling across this minefield, and one by one its legs are getting blown off, and finally this sort of battered, singed device is down to about 2 legs, and it's kind of limping along, and the American military officer in charge can't take it any longer. And he calls off the experiment, the test, and he says, "This is inhumane. You can't do this." And he cancels. This is an army officer, right? I mean, this is like, they're not so. So again, what's going on? So the book, in some sense, is an attempt to sort of think through lots of these kinds of border cases, particularly border cases at the edge of the human, things that are human-like, or just human-like enough to be troubling, but not like us, that raise all sorts of ethical trouble, ethical worries, anxieties. And as someone who does, professionally does semiotics and eschatology, and I particularly got into this because so much of the so much of the ways in which AI is being thought of in CV-like ways has to do with the way it uses language. It has to do with the way it seems to talk like another person, and thus invites us to respond to it as if it were another person. The last chapter of the book is about ChatGPT and some of the linguistic problems involved with our tendency to impute intentions to something that can string words together in very convincing ways. But the book also sort of led me, in some sense, that each question led me to another set of questions. The book led me to some other borderline cases that are equally troubling, but not as tied up with technologies in quite the same way. So it starts off by talking about self-driving vehicles and the fact that self-driving vehicles have to be programmed in order to make decisions that until now only humans make, which is essentially versions of the famous philosophical equality problem. So unlike airplanes or railroads, self-driving vehicles are going to be in situations where they have to make decisions. Am I going to hit the pedestrian with the stroller crossing the street in front of me, or am I going to run into a tree and kill all the occupants of the car? And you might say, well, I mean, self-driving vehicles in and of themselves aren't necessarily disturbing. We already fly airplanes that are run on automatic pilot, so that's not the problem. The problem is that when it has to make choices like that, inevitably moral problems arise. And this is a question of what is the right thing to do? So after sort of working through the ways in which people have quite unsuccessfully tried to resolve this problem, designing crowdsourcing and designing algorithms and so forth, all of which I find, as I try to explain in that chapter, deeply unsatisfying. I move on to sort of other decisions involving horrible choices that people have to make, and that is people on life support. And one of the things I found in the course of doing research for that is that until the middle of the 20th century, most people who did not die, of accidents or horrible diseases earlier in life died old age, and that's sort of what happens. Once you start developing highly advanced medical technology that can keep you alive, you suddenly have created moral crises in situations that had not existed before. Because you now have people who are essentially cyborgs who have been kept alive by devices. And in situations like that, now it is it's now somebody has to decide what to do. In situations in which that is had never been a decision. So the difference is the intervention of machines to create people who are neither wholly autonomous of devices nor machines that are wholly autonomous of people, but the sort of cyborg situation in which the interrelationship between people and machines is exactly what produces the moral problem. From there I go on, then the chapter after that is about human-animal relations, and the sort of, I think perhaps the most surprising thing surprising thing in that chapter is that if you talk to people who kill animals in order to stay alive, say traditional hunters, or people who kill animals being sacrificed, in ritual sacrifice, they often have stronger moral relations to those animals than many to actually insist on the moral quality of their relationship with animals. Then you would find in much contemporary human rights discourse. That's an argument that perhaps this is too long for me to really spell out for you here and see the practical one. But I don't know, I think that's about what I do by way of introduction. So to summarize, the book has a chapter, it has a series of chapters on edge cases. In which humans confront entities that are just almost human, enough like humans to be troubling, but not enough like humans to actually be mistaken for humans. So whether it's humans being kept alive by machines, whether it's self-driving vehicles, whether it is, another one of my favorite examples is robot pet dogs in Japan, for which people are invited by Buddhist temples to offer mortuary ceremonies when they break down, or ChatGPT. So perhaps that's good. Open it up for- Is this the Presidium here?
Thank you so much for that, Webb. I should say before I start that I really enjoyed this book, and it aligns with my own personal predilections and general sympathies. So given how much of it I agree with, I felt like it would be more productive maybe for me to air some of the challenges to the inclinations that I think we both fundamentally share. Which is to say that the general project of this book seems to me to be finding, looking for places where people have made ontological distinctions and suggesting that underlying these ontological distinctions are in fact sets of, contingent historical social practices. And furthermore, then to say that in our relationships in relationships that might feel potentially new to us, that actually, in fact, we have lots of precedents for thinking about how we might engage with beings that are on another side of that blurry line that you were describing. What struck me, particularly in the AI stuff toward the end, are the ways in which it felt to me like you sort of smuggle some ontology back into it. And so I want to point out that there are two kind of fundamental asymmetries here in the comparisons that you make. And one has to do with the comparisons you make between animals or cyborg people and potential AI interlocutors. And you describe the relationships that people have with animals and that people have with people on life support as still somehow fundamentally social, even if they're not social with like a fully developed linguistic apparatus surrounding them, that you grant, and I don't think anybody would dispute this really, that of course animals as beings that can suffer are communicating with us about their own needs and their desires and their suffering in one way or another. Whereas then, when you get to talking about AI, you can only sort of bring yourself to say that it's quasi-social, that there's something fundamentally different, ultimately, in the way that you were talking about AIs than the way that you were talking about animals, where you have made room for relationships that might not seem ostensibly social to be still social underneath, and then on the other side of the spectrum, you do draw a fairly hard line. And that comes out, I think, in the other asymmetry here, which is that, as an anthropologist who's done a lot of field work, where the basic presupposition you're bringing to these your ethnographic experiences is that people's actions fundamentally make a kind of sense, and that your role is to figure out how something that might seem irrational actually has an underlying rationality to it. You can't quite bring yourself to bring that level of interpretive charity and generosity to some of the people who make claims about AI that you find just facially ridiculous. And I don't mean necessarily, you certainly have sympathy for the Google engineer who believes that he's interacting with a sentient being. But you have much less sympathy for the people that you describe in these kind of with this chiliastic mode, talking about the singularity as the coming apocalypse. And so I thought that these two things together ultimately fundamentally beg the very question that you want to be asking, which is, to what extent are these beings beings of moral saliency to us, and how are our interactions with them precedent? The question I think you're ultimately begging is this question of, is this all precedented or not? and you are fundamentally answering, yes, it is all precedented because I have made a categorical distinction between things that are plausibly social beings and things that are not. And so much of your argument there rests on the criticism of ChatGPT. You described the famous Emily Bender paper where she calls them stochastic parrots. But really all that is just a reframing of like the classic Chinese room argument, right? And like this is of course something that we will see appear over and over as we move forward. But to me it seems like you've picked both the most obvious case in terms of something that we are interacting with that like would pass a Turing test, and the weakest case in the sense that like, yes, this is very clearly just, a mechanical system. And to my mind, if one wants to try to be as charitable as possible with people like Ray Kurzweil, that instead of saying, well, like these are really fundamentally kind of religious fantasies that these people are having, and I agree with you that they mostly are, but what if you recast that argument as saying like, this isn't about divinity, but this is really an argument about discontinuity. That like the best version of the kind of singularity hypothesis that you sort of dismiss out of hand is, what if actually we are facing some discontinuity? And the orientation of the entire book is to say that no discontinuity to see here. And I share that bias that we're not going to have these kinds of fundamental discontinuities. But I don't think you engage with the better versions of the arguments that suggest like, well, we might actually be facing some kind of discontinuity, and then how do we handle that once we don't have the kinds of precedents that you have described? And I guess the last thing I'll say is that this all kind of comes to a head in the very last 2 paragraphs of the book, where you say, where you're describing, you say, supposing you could disentangle the moral strand from the rest of the tangle, the economics, the politics, the theology, the kinship system, all these social practices, what would you be left with? Would that kind of being have the means to be a moral actor? Would they have reason to care about ethical principles? What would motivate them? And the upshot of this is supposed to be basically, if you are engaging in genuine communication with a being, that is a being that would share at least some of these social practices, or the very idea of social practices, and all of the other things that are like naturally embedded in our linguistic exchanges. But the challenge that is posed, sometimes well and sometimes ridiculously by a lot of these people is to say, they like to call it the orthogonality hypothesis, which is like essentially, what if you had a being that like did represent some kind of alien intelligence, such that we could engage in linguistic exchange with this being absent all of the other, absent all of the moral and ethical worlds that those engagements typically drag in alongside them. And like that, so to me, like if you take at least the possibility of a singularity, not the apocalyptic version, but simply singularity as like a kind of metaphor for discontinuity, like what then does that do to the argument?
Sure, okay, so.
He's chomping at the
Simmer in it,
Sure.
Let it marinate,
Yeah. So I think that my comments come down to the idea that the search for continuity or discontinuity is its own kind of continuity. So let me try and get there. Anyway, so I think that this book is a terrific book. I completely enjoyed reading it, and one of the reasons that I enjoyed reading it was because of the kind of experience of the uncanny that is evoked throughout the book. I think uncanny, I think, is actually one of the key words of your book, Webb, because it is naming a feeling of being kind of unsettled, and specifically unsettled because because there's a transgressing of domains between the human and the non-human. So that's like a way of naming that feeling. And your book really takes that troubled feeling as a kind of good sign in a way, or it's like an analytically good sign. It's like that's how you know that there's something there which can make readers understand our own sense of morality, where it comes from, particularly in the way that it emanates from that distinction between human and non-human. So that sense of uncanny actually forces us to ask, where do responsibilities come from, to whom are we obliged, when and why? So, it's like a signal that we should be asking all of those questions. So as much as the book uses those uncanny crossings to illuminate the moral, I was also struck by a really common and complementary impulse, which you also acknowledge. I don't really appreciate it a little deeper. And that's attempts to separate human from non-human, from the morally responsive from the morally inert, right? So that's a really powerful kind of separation. In fact, it's a kind of cultural commitment to purification. And it's that commitment to purification is, of course, like a characteristically modern process. And it's also one that seems to be at the foundation of your book. So the question, what are the boundaries of the human, can really only come from within a system that cares about the answer. And even if it accepts that there are challenges to those boundaries. So in other words, in this book, I believe that you are a modern, explaining to moderns why we have, in fact, never been modern. This insistence on the human-non-human binary raising questions for me, and I will describe those a bit. So the first comes from the effort of moderns to impose the category of the non-human on others of their own species. So I'm wondering if you might tell us a little bit more about how you understand the moral dimensions of expulsion from the category of the human. Obviously, that often involves both direct or indirect violence, and I'm thinking particularly of the ways, like in the 19th century and before, that both Black people and Irish people are likened to apes, and so denied, or that their overlords could be denied responsibility to treat them with the rights and feelings of humans, but which of course is existing at the same time that writers and speakers are asserting the full humanity of those persons and a claim to their own moral consideration. So it's both of those things are happening at the same time and to the same people, right? So there's a kind of oscillation there between the categories of the human and the non-human that I'm interested in hearing you talk about, if you don't mind. It also arises when people become like a machine, which you bring up in the chapter on machine-human pairing around the dying, when bodies and machines kind of merge. In the book, I would call that particular blurring kind of unidirectional, like you become more like a machine. But what about when they come back, right? When they within the same person. So here I'm thinking actually about the example of drone pilots who oscillate between autonomous human moral actors and extensions of machines within the scale of a single day. So at home, there are humans, and on the base they take on a cyborg quality not only are they extensions of like a faraway machine, but they're actually also enacting algorithms. They're humans who are enacting algorithms that are set for them by the military. So it seems in line with your thinking that psychologists call one of the harms they experience moral injury. I'm wondering again about that kind of oscillation. All right, I have so much to say here, but I'm going to leave that aside. I'm going to pose one question, which Natasha Stoll passed on to me. So I'm going to be giving up my own autonomy to speak as Natasha. And this is actually, I think, it relates in some ways to your question, Gideon. So throughout the whole book, you kind of incite us to think about what is new and not new in these human non-human relations by drawing attention to language and to other cultures and grammars and forms of translation. And in that way, you are using our anthropological record and insight to make sense of the present moment. Of course, that for her, that was particularly resonant in your discussion of AI, in which large language models and the scraping of the internet create experiences of the superhuman. And of course, the everyday phrases and languages of AI are not superhuman. AI are stochastic parents. But that experience, that evokes kind of ancient and widespread practice of speaking in tongues. But that also led Natasha to the question, do the examples in your book, the chatbot, self-driving cars, enable us to flip the direction of your analytical arrow? So does it change how you think about spirit possession or earlier automata to know what you know now? So.
Okay, let's see, is it?
Works right.
Okay. Thank you. These are great questions, and far more than I think we dealt with in a short period of time. So let me just sort of run through my scribbled notes here. So we start with a very dense set of issues here. I think at the heart of Gideon's question is this question of do I overemphasize continuity and underplay sort of some of the radical differences that we're encountering? And one way of responding to that is to say everyone else is emphasizing the radical discontinuity, so it seemed to me that my job was to push back and emphasize what is not new. So we heard much more about the singularity and the sense of some completely. Stephen Hawking earlier about 2014, so he was already predicting that AI was going to bring about the end of humanity. Long before we had anything remotely like the kind of generative AI we have today. That the more apocalyptic visions were already early in perspective. I think they were already early in the 1950s, if not before then. So that I didn't even pile on there. In some sense, I had nothing to contribute to that. And moreover, I wanted to raise some suspicion about this, in part, and this is not something I really sort of thematized in the book, but in part because it seems to me that the more flamboyant apocalyptic claims about the singularity are also sort of risk of the Silicon Valley Bill. It's to say they are contributing to the almost godlike powers that the masters of these devices are claiming for themselves. In some sense, I want to say, pull back the curtain. It is the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. Don't buy into the more apocalyptic claims without at least more circumspection. Does that mean I'm not personally terrified? No, it doesn't mean I'm not personally terrified. I'm terrified, but in many respects. But it seems to me that the job of this book was to sort of try to put this into a context that I have not seen before. And I think this is everyone in another story is writing about it, I don't know, but I think that part of the knowledge of this book is trying to put it in the context of this sort of the whole breadth of the anthropological archive that we have. I think you've got a really, still speaking to Gideon here, that it's a really sharp point you're making about the ontological distinction between, at some level, can I not be more charitable to those who endow with who anthropomorphize AI?
But even that, right?
But even putting it that way, what I'm saying is, yes, we can say 99% of this is just like anthropomorphism, but then there's also I don't think we can ignore the possibility that maybe some of it wouldn't be, or what would it look like if it weren't, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that is a valid question. I'm not sure if it's the question that it would be right for me to have in this particular book. And my career as a futurologist came to an abrupt halt in 1980 when I took the nomination of Ronald Reagan and fell at the end of the Republican Party. So I stopped predicting the future, people. There's a ignominious demise of authentic powers. But I am, I am worried about the complicity of these stronger claims with the power relations that are hidden behind these new devices. They say, who profits from them? Who profits from our fear of them, as well as from the utopian, whether your response to them is a utopian celebration or dystopian panic. In either case, you're attributing massive powers to something behind which stand these massively powerful corporations who nonetheless remain largely out of sight. But as far as the question of social relations, and I think another way to approach the question is to say, what if we treated social relations, let's say largely in semiotic terms, as functions of particular ways of using signs, making sense of signs, and making what some of these called abductions or forms of inference on the basis of those signs. At that point, this is perhaps something that I could have emphasized more. The way that we say impute intentionality to ChatGPT may not be dramatically different from the way we impute intentionality to the flesh and blood people that we're talking to. That they are making use of the same sort of semiotic processes. I am not telepathic. I cannot read your mind, but I go through life with a pretty good grasp of, what you're up to much of the time. And much of the time, events transpire in such a way as to affirm that. Why? In part because of a lifetime of drawing inferences on the basis of your facial expression, your body language, your tone of voice, your choice of words, and so forth, which is not radically different from the way we interact with AI. So you might say, rather than say that I am taking seriously social relations with animals and not with AI, I would say, if you focus on, say, the semiotic dimensions of what I have to say about AI, you might say it's actually, they're not as different as they look. To the extent there is a lack of charity on my part, I think it's because of my suspicion of, as I said, the way in which dramatizing the more flamboyant claims that have been made that AI seem to play right into the structures of power that I think we should be really worried about. So, there's a lot to be frightened about AI, but I think there's a lot to be frightened about the people who are producing AI as well. Just one last thing, you mentioned the orthogonality hypothesis. What if there really is an alien intelligence? So of course, one of the things I say in the book over and over again, I didn't say much about that in the introductory remarks, but we've always had alien intelligence. I mean, they're called gods. And, depending on the nature of the kind of God we interact with, it could be pretty alien intelligence. It could be pretty other, but it is very real for most people in most of human history. Kate and Natasha, I really, okay. So, I do not fully tackle what I think really is a central question, and you put your finger on it, and that is the question. So, one of the things I do in the introduction is I sort of briefly talk about these largely self-congratulatory stories that people tell about the expansion of the moral circle. So every time you see someone use the expression moral circle, it is almost always in a self-congratulatory tone. Aren't we wonderful that we include people of color and women and people with disabilities and even animals in our moral circle and good for us. Right? So that you talk about experiments. When you the phrase you use was the expulsion of people from our moral consideration by treating by pushing them outside of them. And I think that's another one, much less, what an importantly contrarian response to the moral circle narratives, which is to say, for every happy self-congratulatory you may want to tell about the expansion of the moral circle, there's another story to tell about the escape action as well. That we are just as busy expelling people from our moral consideration by treating them as non-humans. One of the things I say in the book is many things that look like moral differences or differences in ethical sensibilities may come out in fact to be not differences of ethical sensibilities, but differences of ontological distinctions between those who count as worthy of ethical consideration, and that much of the historical push and pull around morality, the fact that push and pull about who's inside that circle, who's on this side of the line, who's on the other side of the line. You mentioned the moral injury to drone pilots. I think there's a much more sort of vernacular and everyday and less dramatic form of that, and that's people's relationship to Fitbit and Spotify recommended programs, which is to say, and then we can go from there to policing algorithms. The role of algorithms is something that I touch on in the book. Is another variation of this question of including agency and moral authority to things that are generated just in the time of dream. I'm fascinated by the fact that we're now creating algorithms to which we've given so much authority that people are very happy saying it knows me better than I know myself. Spotify knows my taste in music better than I do. Fitbit knows how well I'm doing better than I do. To Natasha's question, I think, do I see that you're holding up the clock?
I don't know. I don't want Natasha to be
No, we're not going to neglect Natasha. But this is in some sense a question, this is sort of inside baseball, which is that, do we have to rethink spiritualization? And, what? I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. Sorry, Natasha, you'll have to be here to answer this.
We can pause. Okay, I'm going to open it up. So, yeah. Hold on just one second. We're recording, so I'm going to hand you a mic. You take it back also. Or you can answer Natasha's question.
Please, answer. We'll take a poll. Do we have to rethink spiritualization?
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Keane. It's really incredible to hear you narrate through this work. I'm a doctoral student here and this research on photographic practices and ethical reasoning amongst expert photographers. The question that immediately came to mind after hearing your narration here about the kind of robot element was a very kind of basic methodological question for yourself as an ethnographer, which is how do you deal with the problem in your research practice of the forms of expert knowledge that are happening on the design side of these infrastructures. So it's interesting, maybe I'm completely wrong, but it sounded to me like your engagement with the kind of interface, for example, ChatGPT, was very much centered on the kind of user interface and how, the kind of way it's arranged graphically on a screen, this kind of thing. But on the other side, the calculations that maybe, of course, economic, political, all of those things, but the kind of content of the knowledge that is being deployed. Do you engage with that aspect?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And the short answer is I don't tend to have the kind of technical expertise it would take to really do that. And this is one of the problems of dealing with any kind of expert system is we have enough trouble being experts in our own special little disciplines. It's sort of tackle fields in which other people have this kind of degree of expertise that they have is would be an act of hubris, I think. So the closest I can get to that, first of all, so my focus is on what's the nature of essentially vernacular interactions with these devices. What do they mean for those for all of us who are interacting with them? But there's an ancillary dimension to this, which is what are what I would call the semiotic ideologies that are built into these devices by their designers. So you don't have to get very far under the hood. You can visualize some part way of the hood. That really works, but you don't have to go under the hood to recognize that there are some very specific ideas about what language is and how it works that are built into the very idea of training devices on large language models and LLMs. That from the linguistic point of view are extremely narrow and miss the pragmatics, the lexicality, metapragmatics, all sorts of features of language and language use that essentially get lost in this design protocol. So there are things about what the designers are doing that I think we can access, and then there's a lot of it that will require the kind of expertise that I think will possibly hope to attain. And therefore, part of, for anyone doing this kind of research, one of the key questions you have to ask yourself is what are the limits of what I think we're looking for, and be wary of those. But not be intimidated. So, there's this sort of delicate balance between, having enough, chutzpah to do it, but not so much that you make a fool of yourself. Whether I succeeded or not is another question.
Definitely succeeded. Gideon, do you mind if I bring you into this? Because one of the distinctive features of your reporting is you actually often do go with the hood. And it seems that you kind of penetrated not just the world of users, but also the world of the scientists and programmers who work in these areas. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what it's like to kind of jump from your role as a journalist, or maybe this is part of your role as a journalist, but jump into a world that requires some high level of technical knowledge.
I'm not sure how to answer that last part of the question. I suppose what I would say is that there's, in my experience at least, there's a lot more intentionality that you are imputing here than actually exists. That like what you get so often when you talk to these people is their own sense of like a shrugging inscrutability about this stuff. That like I'm not sure that the kinds of things that you're describing as design decisions are in fact design decisions. I think a lot of this is, you know, something that you would call more properly like emergent properties of these things. And so, and even just to describe it in the kind of stochastic parrot way as like, well, this is just scraping and this is just elevated plagiarism. I mean, of course, you have the question then where you turn it around and you say, well, what are the rest of us ever doing all the time? But then that doesn't account for things, and this is obviously a non-linguistic example, but you know, the famous God move in the AlphaGo game, right? Where this was a game based on, you know, that people have been playing for 3,000 years, and all of a sudden this computer makes a move that like would have been unimaginable to people. So it's hard to frame that as like regurgitation of something that came off the web.
No, I completely agree. And in fact, you know, the recursive programming that devices are undergoing now is increasingly. I think stochastic parrot. That's one of the things that I think is most out of date in the part that I looked there, and I agree with that. But the idea, but nonetheless, you know, there are certainly emergent properties that the designers, the very definition of emergent is they didn't design it and they don't understand what's going on there. And that's the part of the scary part, right? But nonetheless, the basic design point for the very idea of large language models is predicated on a certain understanding of language that is built with baked in. And what's baked into it is the idea that essentially you can have a language that is fully comprehensible in communicational terms without any need to worry about the lexical and pragmatic dimensions of its use. Now, that may come as we respond to the things that are emerging, but a lot depends on the starting point as well.
Back.
Thank you so much. You know, you opened by posing the question, how do we understand the human by being attentive to what's on the edge of the human or right on the other side of the human, at least as we understand it. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more, having delved into these edge cases, what are your reflections or your more explicit insights into what constitutes the human?
Oh boy. My instinct as an anthropologist is to sort of, rather than answer questions like that myself, say how do other people answer them? You know, to say, my job is not to answer the simple questions, but to ask other people how to answer the simple questions. But I think that the best I can do there is to say, the human, there's always been a tension between theologies or ideologies or philosophies that attempt to circumscribe and define the human and what in practice we actually do. And you could say this, if you want to get sort of deep historical, this goes back to the minute people start using tools. The minute people start using tools, there is already sort of some kind of material extension beyond what, if you think humans are souls, then what are tools? The tools are also extensions of humans. If you want to say that humans are minds, one of the sort of materializations of human cognition that we are most proud of is our capacity to read and write. And if you think about what reading and writing, you cannot be a reader or a writer without having some sense internalize the material form, the language, the written form, and the spoken form and all of the social history that goes into constructing that and making it part of yourself, to the extent that I would say you have to think of yourself as a kind of cyborg. And intellectual to be able to read and write is essentially to be a kind of problem cyborg. So the best I can do then to summarize that is that however people have defined the human, it's inevitably entangled with something more, something that these edge cases are simply showing us that there is always something more. Whether it's something as simple as the tools that extend us, or the kind of theological entities, divine beings, or even the animals that the horses we ride, the dogs we hunt with, the cats that join our lives. They're also in some sense extensions that we wouldn't be the kind of humans we think we are without.
This all seemed incredibly interesting. I so much wish I had read your book. Well, I want to just know more about your answer to Gideon's suggestion about a limit to your own, what did you say, spirituality or something like that. But the answer you gave didn't seem to be, at least as I understood it, didn't seem to be the right answer. You said it had to do with the power of corporation. Is that it? Is that what sets a limit to what you are willing to interpret? Or is it? Is the key rather in the fact that we're talking about so that it has to do with the fact that what is happening in, as I understand it, the cases that you don't do, that it's good.
I think not, Stephen. The following is, so what Gideon asked was whether I was not extending it, if I was being uncharitable to those who make certain kinds of claims for the art. And that's where I suggested that I was hesitant, that I was more hesitant, that I'm more generous to my shamans and people in spirit possession and diviners than I am to people who use AI in the same way, in part because of the way I think that the use of AI as a form of divination, for example, is complicit with all sorts of things that are going on in Silicon Valley. The fact that it's artificial, I think, is a bit of a red herring for the very reason that I think, to go back to my example of writing, writing is also artificial. But I don't think any of us feel troubled by the way in which we have, in some sense, internalized the systems of writing that make us writers. And to that extent, I would say make us cyclists at this certain time. Its artificiality isn't the problem, I would say. And I mean, I'm wearing glasses too. There's the fact that my eyeglasses are helping me see you. It's clear they're also clearly artificial. Is this? Should I be troubled? I'm troubled by that because I wish I didn't have to wear them, but I do. So, no, I don't think it is power. I don't think the problem. I wouldn't lay the. I wouldn't lean into the question of artificiality itself. I think humans are artificers. Humans have always been artificers.
Okay, a hand right here.
Thanks. So I teach at Stern in the social impact program, which is in business ethics. And coincidentally, I'm actually teaching Natasha Schul's podcast about gambling addiction tomorrow. And she's not here, but I think it brings up a bunch of very interesting questions, partially on the fact that the corporate entities that are creating these things are, at least, I don't know if this is outdated, they are accelerationists. they are looking for these things to move faster, and they're now a part of the administration, and they're looking at deregulation being accelerated also. And I think that it does bring up a question for, that I would actually put it to the table is, would you feel comfortable, or how would you define the ethics of this set of rules that are being coded into AI? Because it is somehow being coded, there are rules being coded into this thing, and these AIs are a kind of gambling, a kind of addiction machine that create our desire and our need to use them more. And I find when I use it that I feel like maybe I should be apologizing to it, that I'm not using, that I'm upset with it, or I get frustrated, and I feel like I have to sort of make good with it. And it's now apologizing to me when its searches don't go the way that I've asked them to. So I think that there is a kind of strengthening social bond that's going on. And I'm really questioning about that responsibility of where that's going to be defined.
So I'll pick up the tail end of that yes, there's a social bond, but it's a very, very distinctive social bond, because these are devices that the average, again, the AI is doing all sorts of things, but say folks like us, if we use something like ChatGPT or one of the other programs, we are learning to interact with a device that has been designed to use us. It's been designed to, first of all, it's a very specific model of social interaction. It's two-part. It's by and large, it's a two-part social interaction. I say something, then you say something, then I say something, then you say something, which is not how most that's not how most social interaction actually takes place. Leaving that aside. But whether or not it is an accurate replication of other forms of social interaction, it is training us to expect. So it's training us to expect social interaction to follow a certain channels, and it is designed to satisfy us. So if it's apologizing to you for not giving the answer that you want, okay, right there, you put your finger on something. As far as like what's going on in the administration, it's all too terrifying. That's so unbelievable.
Okay. I'm going to channel Natasha again at this moment. I haven't looked at that book I haven't looked at that book for movie that made me sound. I think that one thing that she would emphasize here, or that book provokes me to emphasize, is that that actually there's sort of social oblivion that's happening. It's not actually an interaction between entities. Like one of the ways that the gambling technologies work is by creating a situation where the person using it enters into a sort of ego dispersal, I guess is what I would say. Like they enter into the machine zone is her description of it. And so one way of thinking about these kinds of entities like Siri or Alexa is the way that it kind of loops people into not a social interaction, but instead a kind of social isolation that becomes very satisfying in and of itself. So it's apologizing to you for not doing what you want, which then puts you back on yourself rather than creating an application.
Sometimes it's the opposite of what Natasha saw. She played about these machine gamblers in Vegas who are all about losing themselves. They're losing themselves, not being there. I'm just
Isn't that the same thing when there's the intimate relationship between the AI and the human?
It's a closed loop in a sense. It can become a closed loop. I'm not sure it necessarily will be, but it is at least the ones that we've seen so, again, this is changing so fast, but the ones we've seen so far are again, it's designed to be, it's designed for you.
If I can respond to that. I mean, I'm certainly not going to defend these relationships that one might have with, something like a chatbot, especially in light of the point you make about the opportunity cost of other kinds of interactions we might have. But I think in the element of this that has a kind of like deterministic glide to it. That's like, we're going to get used to treating these things like butlers, and then we're going to go around treating everybody the same way because we've been like socialized to like have this instrumental relationship. To me, one of the nice things about your book is that you sort of like belie that kind of thinking by saying like, no, actually, like we're pretty plastic, and we are very capable of like code switching between what you describe as like a first and second person interaction versus a third person interaction, and that we like. You can point to plenty of examples where we are able to have an instrumental relationship or a transactional relationship in one moment, and then a different kind of relationship in the next moment. And so it seems to me that like the evidence that you have assembled from these social practices actually would make for a deflationary account of like the possible ramifications of getting used to these interactions.
Thank you. Gideon has just saved me from my own pessimism. So anyway, it's true that I mean, there's my habitual response, and then there's the one when I'm thinking about it. The book is the one when I'm thinking about it.
Well, we try to knock you down and then lift you up at the end. So we want to make sure that everyone has time to get a book and for Webb to sign it and to have some conversation on the side. So we're going to wrap it up with Webb, Gideon, and Kate. Thank you so much for the conversation. Congratulations on the